Joining us now, Republican Senator David Perdue of Georgia. Senator, thanks so much for being here. Some really fascinating things coming out of this bill unveiling this morning. At one point, Senator Scott saying that this legislation is already bipartisan. Now the question is, can we get bipartisan support for it? What's your response? Can they?
Well, we've proven on some of the big things that we can. Justice reform back in 18, the First Step Act, we got that done. That was historic. I believe we'll rise to this occasion, but I think the first test is going to be next week. Will we be able to get Democrats to vote with us to get on the bill on the floor of the Senate? If we can't do that, then I think that demonstrates a lack of sincerity on their side to at least engage and let's find solutions to the problems that we're talking about today. I'm very proud of Tim Scott and the team that Mitch McConnell's put together to go at this. But let me highlight one thing he just said. We have about 70% alignment right now with what we hear the House is working on. We never start with anything that's high in terms of alignment. So I'm very optimistic that we'll put politics aside and get to some solutions here that will really make a difference. I think the Justice Act is a starting point, as Senator Sass said. This may not be the end all, but this could be a start. Look, I remember the 60s in my lifetime, and we made a start there. But obviously today, we've got to get serious about continuing this effort to make justice for all a reality in America.
Senator, obviously part of the news out of this news conference was Leader McConnell saying he's going to go to Tim Scott's bill next week and that there'll be a vote next week, and we'll see whether or not Chuck Schumer and the Democrats block that. What do you see as a low-hanging fruit here? Are you in favor of, when we look at this bill, restrictions on chokeholds, the no-knock warrants? What are 3 or 4 things that you think Republicans and Democrats can agree on here, sir?
Well, here are the highlights. And first of all, I think he's right. I think it will be a test, but this is where we have to put politics aside. And if they block this bill, I think it'll demonstrate a lack of willingness to really solve the problem. Look, President Trump is leading this effort with this executive order. He's supportive. And what I see here are a couple of highlights. Number one is the police forces have to reflect the demographics of the communities they serve in order to get confidence back up. That's a major precept here. The second is I believe that we need more training in these police forces to make sure that we talk about when to use force and what level of force is appropriate. The use of lethal force is an outrageous extreme that we need to be very careful about in this training. So I think that's one right there that is a big effort in both bills that I hear about. And then the last, I think, is that we need this database. We need to make sure that bad apples don't just flow from one police precinct to another or from one jurisdiction to another. Those are some of the highlights. The chokeholds and all. Look, let's get this on the floor, and we can then get a majority vote on some of the details. But the only way to make this any better is to get it on the floor of the Senate and really work this. And let me highlight this, Ed. The fact that we already can put this bill on the floor, I've got bills I've been trying for 5 years to get on the floor of the Senate. To already put this on the floor of the Senate shows the importance that Mitch McConnell is putting on this and that we as Republicans see.
Senator, as we speak, the House Judiciary Committee, they began their markup session to craft the police abuse bill in the House. They're going to vote June 25th. So that started at 10 a.m. Eastern time. But to go back to your last point, Senator Tim Scott there saying that if we can't move quickly on this police bill, I don't think, quote, the nation's going to allow us to lose the momentum, really identifying this moment that we are in and the momentum at the back of lawmakers to get something done. Senator Scott went on to say about curbing qualified immunity for officers. He said that's a poison pill from my perspective. Where does that issue go?
Well, I think it needs to be debated on the floor. I mean, obviously, even in our caucus, and I would argue that inside the Democratic caucus, there's probably difference of opinion. But what we see in the House doing is probably an extreme position, but there are points between where we are now and what the House may be trying to put forward that might be a reasonable solution. This is what legislating is all about. Look, many of the bills up here that we pass in a bipartisan way never make anybody totally happy. That's called compromise, and that's what we all came here to do. The problem is partisan politics gets in the way, and my prayer is that in this issue, in order to not waste these lives that have already been lost, is that we get to a bottom line here and actually get something meaningful done that can change America.
Senator, as you know, this is a very important substantive debate, but it's also playing out in the context of a heated presidential campaign. What do you think about the question raised by Lindsey Graham in this news conference? What did the Obama-Biden administration do for 8 years? When you see Democrats out front blaming President Trump, they had 8 years in office. Joe Biden had a lot more time in the Senate, where you are, before that.
Well, first of all, they didn't do anything to help the economic wherewithal of communities of color in the United States. That's a fact. We had 8 years of the lowest economic growth in U.S. history under the Obama-Biden administration. More regulation, more taxes, shut down energy, backed up from the rest of the world, shut down trade. I mean, we know what not to do. It's what they did during those 8 years. What we did in the first 3 years under President Trump has benefited the communities of color more than any other president in my lifetime, for sure, and maybe since the Civil War. What we've done is we've helped 2.5 million people pull themselves out of poverty over the last 3 years prior to COVID-19. We've created 7.5 million new jobs, and many of those are in these communities of color that needed economic help. We've approved communities of economic distress. We've put opportunity zones. We've funded HBCUs. I mean, these are things that really will make a difference over time. That did not happen under the Obama-Biden administration.
Senator, I just want to finish off with this. There's some quick reaction already coming in from the Congressional Black Caucus Chairwoman Bass on the bill just introduced by Senator Scott, saying, quote, "I haven't read the language of the bill, but it looks like he takes the teeth out of some of our proposals. So, for example, there's not a ban on chokeholds, but we are going to study chokeholds." So we'll look for continued reaction from all that. Senator Perdue, appreciate you coming on this morning.
Thanks, Senator.
Thanks, Senator. Thanks, Ed.